I realize that there are elements of my testimony which could cause a problem for Israelis in Pittsburgh. John Schulman was arrested on a multi-million dollar museum heist. One of his employers frequented the house of a Donald Trump speechwriter, ghostwriter, who would disguise his voice as Abdul, the terrorist on KDKA radio, when he was a Jewish boy, a mercenary. We now know working for Trump. But although my concerns became a sense of responsibility when it came to Palestine in the 80s when I was at the Pitt News, it's important to understand that while I did stare into space in shock at the way the journalism had broken down during the firestorms in Iraq and Afghanistan, and eventually snap out of it enough to write my research paper on refugees from Syria, which is still very informative. It was done for the Honors Department of Pittsburgh's Community College of Allegheny County. I believe that interest that could possibly be shown my attendance. I'm a deaf man, so attendance can be a problem. I'm not that gifted. I struggled to secure documents and essays and books on Palestine over the years. Beginning in 1913, and I've read people like Chaim Weitzman who explain their motives behind the Balfour Declaration after World War I think a person attending this tape would probably be more interested in what I say inadvertently, and in the hopes that I might say something helpful inadvertently, I'm willing to go through with you some notes and thoughts and scattered debris of memory. For example, someone presented me with the legal specifications of the status of Palestinians in Israel in the 1980s. Now, it's important to remember, I was at Pitt News before I was called to Mount Desert Island, before the incident at Kelly School, in contact with Peter Gabriel and faith with Robert Fripp. My reasons for being helpful were humane ones. My father had been senior faculty at Pitt and had a human tendency in his writing to be open to reform. Anybody who reads my poem, Irises, can understand that cultivating sensibilities, not hostilities, seemed to me an aesthetic preference. But it was one that was under combat and siege in Pennsylvania, and I had appealed to other artists. I didn't understand labor very well. I didn't understand the University of Pittsburgh, but I knew that Pittsburgh had threatened to kill me. I was hoping they could help me protect my sanity from childhood trauma. And it was before the virginity topic became a focal point for Obama's persecution and poison crimes directed at my person. The insanity of the way I was sacrificed to their sales pitch from Jeff and for Yoko Ono. I knew none of this. People might think, oh, when I contacted Peter Gabriel, I knew I was being observed by the Beatles. I didn't. All I thought was a couple of rock stars had rolled the dice among their fan base, and I had convinced them that I was a human being and it might be interesting to correspond with me. That's all. When Amanda Harcourt said something about Joni Mitchell, I didn't think Roger Waters. I literally didn't. I just thought, well, she had lunch with Joni Mitchell. I was just trying to keep my wits focused on benign um, development, which was what I was defending when I wrote the strange letter to Leslie. I mean, I didn't threaten her. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was trying to protect myself from the entourage that was promoting barbaric ideas. And Barack Obama turned that around on me, saying I was the source of these ideas, which was not true. And it got gummed up with Reagan stuff those days. I was editorializing. I was trying to call attention to the Hunger Project in Buckminster Fuller, and ecology, and saving the planet. And you might think there was a selfish motive. So do I. I wanted to be able to write poems like irises, just as that wonder striking man who lost his daughter in Palestine just wanted to raise her, but he's beset with responsibilities and agony. The reasons for these afflictions are meritless. They don't make people better. They worsen and lessen us into crying tears of shame. Not because our behavior is shameful, but because the behavior of the men who abuse us is so shameful. We're ashamed of our fellow man. I'm ashamed of what's happening in Gaza. I was ashamed of what was happening in Central America in the 80s. So I said something, I said an environment full of mayhem, fraternity crowds, football players. And they started impinging on my persona, as they put it, making public mockery of me, calling me soft-headed, fondling love beads, and not understanding the nature of reality while they defended Iran-Contra. And my inability to not relate to that was enough to earn me an invitation to see their piranha tank at a booze party. Like something out of Goldfinger. Well, I was not unversed in the era of James Bond films. My father took me to Thunderball and You Only Live Twice. He mentions Thunderball, I believe, in his book, Humanizing the School, along with the names of long forgotten, noble contributing educators. It's a fascinating compendium of important American educators. Humanizing the School is a tremendous work. And of course, my father was known, and the victims of whispers about me, who they regarded as a runt. Well, somebody showed me Palestine. Legal status in Israel. And it was basically their three-fifths of a man. It was the old antebellum South story about slaves on the auction block. I regarded it with a great deal of disbelief. But one of the things the Pennsylvanians are very good at is making you feel that you can't do anything about what's going on. They made me feel like I was a traitor for defending my poetry because I was libertarian enough to believe that I could choose my own aesthetic sensibilities. I believe anybody who reads my favorite poem, Irises, will see why I felt that way. What's traitorous about loving a poem about the Buddha, lilacs, and hummingbirds? Traitor to what? Child molesters putting out songs called Flame Over Africa? I found it incredibly weird that lawyers were banding together to announce authoritarian premises from Hollywood, draconian ones, that if I disbelieved Reagan, it means I committed a spiritual rape. And they were selling this through the grapevine that I had appealed to for help. And I followed my concerns to Mount Desert Island, and they said to have faith in them, that they wanted to know the truth. So I fell in love with someone. But my concerns about Palestine predated that. At the time that the Lockerbie jet crash, Adam Eisenstadt had gone on the radio disguising his voice as Abdul the terrorist, and the motive was to undermine Yasser Arafat's brave, courageous decision to recognize Israel's right to exist, even though they're an occupying power. He recognized the arguments of women like Martha Gellhorn that they had faced cruel and unusual extermination programs in Nazi Germany. I certainly felt that way at the Pitt News. If you read my Reliving the Nightmare, I covered 2 nights of a long film by Klaus Landsman and tried to forgive and believe the Holocaust survivors who had deafened me and the strange circumstances surrounding the suicide of Primo Levi when I wrote to him. I didn't understand what was going on, but I certainly understood the stress and the distress in the eyes of the children of Holocaust survivors in the town I grew up in. I was certainly sympathetic and had learned slowly but surely that I had been given a special education by them, so to speak, which still scares me. And they could see that these realizations were coming from the writing I was doing before the realizations that I had made. And I was concerned for the people of Palestine. They were forced to go to Geneva to recognize Resolution 242, which had been the condition for recognizing them. And Reagan wouldn't allow them to come to New York. They were going to meet his conditions, and he still disallowed it. And frankly, the idea that the way I was tortured was too much to direct an accusation at Reagan about fatigued me because it fit right into his personality, and it certainly was being defended by the Democratic Union machine base that knew all about it. I tried to separate the two things. I tried to put one, Reagan's over here, what happened to me is over here, and then there's this stuff. It was long before I realized that Reagan was hiding the glove that he wore from behind the curtain when he threw the dagger. That it was all shot in the dark from Hollywood. That it was a movement in Axis Hollywood semiotics. It was long before I knew any of that. But people could see the realizations coming. And they said, we can manipulate these realizations. We can profile the neurotrauma to show the seizures he goes into when he's rejected. And Mr. Rogers was in on this. He was nonviolent to Leslie, so we can risk Rose's attentions because we know that he's making a stand against his own enemy within. And so they conjured a performance. The newspapers in New York, in the deaf school in New York, Lexington, I believe it is, no doubt have letters I wrote them concerned for Midori Goto before I knew that Midori Goto was a hoodwinker involved in all of this. Because they masqueraded as the victims. I don't know the etymology. I wonder how you could find it, maybe looking up the word victim in the Oxford English Dictionary. I don't know the linguistic anthropology of the phrase playing victim, where it first arose, whether it was in Hollywood, whether it was in a court, whether it was in squabble politics. But eventually a phrase like that gets around. People accused Palestine of playing the victim, but you could see when newsreels did surface that the Israelis were being brutal barbarians to innocent, unarmed people all the time. And yet, there's a sort of spiritual claustrophobia that sets in. I cannot do anything about it. When I finally tried to do something about it, it was on the subject of Syrian refugees. I had seen photographs of rivers of blood and heard children screaming with fright in newsreels. Now, the situation in Gaza is much, much worse in far more condensed time. It's much worse than most people realize. But I tried to talk about the deprivation of brotherhood, the spiritual ghetto, the fraternity disdain, the self-congratulations of the welcoming society who created the conditions that the refugees are fleeing. And, of course, the divided self that goes back to a phrase John Hope Franklin coined for slaves in the antebellum South who were 3/5 of a man under legal conditions of then before the Confederacy, the slave owning South of the United States of America. The divided South. The way you say, yes, sir, when you deep down feel deeply aggrieved. The punishment of having to hold your tongue when you know you're right, but it's not worth the price you would pay. And there's where Ming No Wen was the most vicious of predators. Because part of me wanted to admit I'm concerned. And she said that this was the spiritual treason of the enemy within. I didn't dare say, I'm concerned. And one of the things I was concerned about was maybe he didn't do this. It needs to be advised or circumvented so that it can be dealt with honorably and legally by the system that we uphold, as I said so carefully in my Pitt News notes. But they're making a leap of faith, and it turns out a dishonest one, mandatory. How can simply admitting you don't know something be treason? I don't know what's going on in this situation, was my conclusion about where things stood at Pitt News. I tried to raise my profile a little bit and got into trouble with people who were using me. I was interfering with what they wanted to use me for. When I wrote my divestment article, which was cleverly misspelled in certain parts, it was clear that I was an intellectual who could grasp the issues in editorialize. It's a reasonable letter to the editor that moved Wesley Pawsfar, I believe, to even go to South Africa and see for himself, come back and divest. I don't know all of the things that went on behind the scenes, but I do know that Wesley Pawsfar was alarmed by my communications, that I had been attacked by boys named Ronnie and Casper in the 1970s. Ronnie and Casper in the 1970s. How many people knew that Ronald Reagan and Caspar Weinberger would be President and Secretary of Defense in 1980? Not that many. 1973, when this happened, not many at all. So he responded. And I know very little about what went on in those offices of the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh. I had hoped that the decisions that were being made were reasonable ones. I'm afraid they may not have been all that perfect, but it certainly doesn't do credit to the University of Pittsburgh that they banned the Phi Theta Kappa scholar, ignored my deafness, ignored the graffiti on my father's obituary, allowed me to be poisoned over and over again in my food supply, in my medical supply, by Reagan's cosmonauts. It doesn't do them credit. There was no wall, but there was no transparency. I sometimes wonder if my biggest mistake in this world wasn't just putting the letter I wrote him into the Pitt News. But it was a very powerful argument in vogue coming down the pipeline from people like Patricia Fripp that I was a irresponsible journalist. I knew that there was difficult material, that I was dealing with people who were stalking me with intent to kill if they got the idea that I was telling on them. They locked me in a house from the inside so they could perpetuate the idea that I was soft on them because I had to curtsy to get out of a house locked from the inside with men who had used me ferociously as a hostage in childhood. And I was unable to say that to anyone. I didn't mislead anybody. I said what I knew would be seen as grounds for great fear. And you would think that a big, brave university like Pitt would have gotten a child psychologist to look at the fact that I was deaf when I had been attacked, that I had a neuroplasm, but they didn't do anything of the kind. Instead, they made it out to look like I was a naive little dreamer. There's a lot of things you can say. These tapes are meant to be guideposts in realizing how Frank Zappa, for example, operated, pretending to be a savant of those affected most by the attack in the 80s, when in reality he was selling the program. It's a very hard thing for anybody to accept. Lenin's Houdini is a function of the letters of Gail Burstyn called the Texas School Book. It's a very, very hard thing for anybody to accept. I certainly didn't know about it. And in that context, a gang like Hamas comes over as part of the fundamentalist military that I'm wary of. Not so wary as to want hostilities towards the Palestinians or even them. But I also know that the feminist pretzel logic that rejects the womanhood and dignity and decency and right to life of Palestinian men, women, and children are only pretending to have ideological differences with the military religion behind the attack. The Axis tripartite authorities, visible in Iran-Contra and the writings of Pope Karl. People need to see deception in the ambiguity of the circumstances we find ourselves in, and be more careful to trust and believe, at least at minimum, the genuine efforts to inform. When someone who cares about you comes forward and says something is wrong, you should at least believe that they think so. Israel should be stopped from what they're doing, and food should be airdropped to their victims, and water should be restored, and electricity should be restored, and sense should be restored to the Jewish community. I understand their anguish, but I don't see where they get the idea that people who befriended them are out to get them when we demand that they stop victimizing innocent people. It makes no sense. We can't make an alliance with something that capitulates to such nonsense.